If you lived to about 80 years old, you would have on par about 4,000 weeks to live. That's the title of the book that I read this weekend, 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. It was an interesting book. It's got a much stronger beginning than it does ending. I read this with aplomb because I thought that it would be kind of a breezy read. It was deeper than I thought it would be. It was actually considerably more, what's the word for it? Sad, depressing, I guess. It really brings to light the mortality that we all face as we are rationing through this life and how short that is. And there's a number of things that he talks about in this book about ways to sort of get you to see how infuriatingly short a human lifespan truly is. At one point, he talked about a survey where he asked people to guess how many weeks were in the human life, and that some people reported as much as 300,000 weeks, which is about the equivalent of all humanity combined. But no, it's really just about 4,000 weeks. In fact, you can sum up about the tone of this book from the book jacket, where he writes, "The average human lifespan is absurdly, insultingly brief. Assuming you live to be 80, you have just over 4,000 weeks." So there you have it, 4,000 weeks, and we're all going to die. Let's dive into this book. I had some things that I had pegged notes into, and looking at my note sheets in here, it's very top heavy into the front, and then by the end, it sort of rattles on a little bit. The book isn't super long. It's about 250 pages, I guess. And it isn't a hard read so much as it is, it's not cumbersome to read. It's hard to read in the sense that it's challenging and it makes you think about your mortality a lot. But there's a little segment in here in the front, in a chapter so painfully titled, "In the Long Run, We're All Dead," where he writes, "This yearning for more meaning can take many forms. It's there, for instance, in the desire to devote yourself to some larger cause, in the intuition that this particular moment in history, with all its crises and suffering, might demand more from you than the usual getting and spending. But it's also there in the feeling of frustration at having to work a day job in order to buy slivers of time for the work you love, and in the simple longing to spend more of your brief time on earth with your kids, in nature, or at the very least, not commuting." The environmentalist and spiritual writer Charles Eisenstein recalls first sensing this basic wrongness in our use of time as a child, growing up amid material comfort in 1970s America, where he writes, quote, "Life, I knew, was supposed to be more joyful than this, more real, more meaningful, and the world was supposed to be more beautiful. We were not supposed to hate Mondays and live for the weekends and holidays. We were not supposed to have to raise our hands to be allowed to pee. We were not supposed to be kept indoors on a beautiful day, day after day." I think that speaks to a lot of us. You recognize and remember all those times that you were in elementary school doing things that you just really just did not want to be doing. But I also think that it would be, we would devolve into that episode of The Simpsons where Homer runs around and he says, "Can't someone else do it?" and just doesn't want to work anymore. And ultimately that one ends up with Homer becoming the garbage commissioner and hiring a bunch of people to go into everyone's house to take out the garbage because he didn't want to do it. And then ultimately they bury it underground in Springfield, and then they have to move the entire town down the street because they ruined the earth. It's a good episode. But the author, Oliver Burkeman, continues writing, "And this feeling of wrongness is only exacerbated by our attempts to become more productive, which seem to have the effect of pushing the genuinely important stuff ever further over the horizon. Our days are spent trying to get through tasks in order to get them out of the way, with the result that we live mentally in the future, waiting for when we'll finally get around to what really matters, and worrying in the meantime that we don't measure up, that we might lack the drive or stamina to keep pace with the speed at which life now seems to move. The spirit of the times is one of joyless urgency," writes the essayist Marilyn Robinson, who observes that many of us spend our lives preparing ourselves and our children to be means to inscrutable ends that are utterly not our own. Our struggle to stay on top of everything may serve someone's interests, working longer hours and usually using any extra income to buy more consumer goods, turns us into better cogs in the economic machine, but it doesn't result in peace of mind or lead us to spend more of our finite time on those people and things we care more deeply about ourselves. 4,000 Weeks is yet another book about making the best use of our time, but it is written in the belief that time management as we know it has failed miserably, and that we need to stop pretending otherwise. That this strange moment in history, when time feels so unmoored, might in fact provide the ideal opportunity to reconsider our relationship with it. This is me talking here. This book was actually published in 2021, and so he's talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and as part of this unmoored, strange time that we live in. He goes on to say, older thinkers have faced these challenges before us, and when their wisdom is applied to the present day, certain truths become more apparent. Productivity is a trap. Becoming more efficient just makes you more rushed, and trying to clear the decks simply makes them fill up again faster. Nobody in the history of humanity has ever achieved work-life balance, whatever that might be, and you certainly won't get there by copying the 6 successful things that people do before 7 a.m. The day will never arrive when you finally have everything under control. He goes on to say, you'll never get to the day when your to-do lists have stopped getting longer, when you're meeting all your obligations at work and in your home, when nobody's angry with you for missing a deadline or dropping the ball, and when the fully optimized person you've become can turn at long last to the things that life is really supposed to be about. Let's start by admitting defeat. None of this is ever going to happen. But you know what? That's excellent news. That's the introduction of this book. I think it's a good introduction of this book too. There are sort of 3 parts to this book. Sort of choosing the things that we do, the things that are beyond our control, and then the afterword, which talks a little bit about being beyond hope for some things. But in the first section about choosing, it says part 1, choosing to choose, but the things that we can control. He talks a little bit about efficiency and life and work balance and these sorts of things that we just talked about in the introduction. And then in the second part, things that are beyond our control, he talks about, impatience and sort of changing our attitude towards culture and some things, because the culture is by and large not something that we can necessarily change on our own. I have a handful of notes in here. Let's just start to run through them real fast. There's a segment in here about Confessions of a Productivity Geek. And something about this necessarily spoke to me. I think it probably does to you too. The rest of this book is an exploration of a saner way of relating to time, and a toolbox of practical ideas for doing so, drawn from the work of philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual teachers who all rejected the struggle to dominate or master it. I believe it sketches a kind of life that's vastly more peaceful and meaningful, while also, it turns out, being better for sustained productivity over the long haul. But don't get me wrong, I spent years trying and failing to achieve mastery over my time. In fact, the symptoms were especially glaring in the subspecies to which I belonged. I was a productivity geek. You know how some people are passionate about bodybuilding or fashion or rock climbing or poetry? Productivity geeks are passionate about crossing items off their to-do list. So it's sort of the same, except infinitely sadder. I think I highlighted that because if somebody had asked me probably even 5 years ago what my life was like, I would say that it's probably a lot of the sort of joyless urgency of crossing things off my to-do list that I would have described to you and said that life, at least my life, felt like, and maybe continues to continue to feel like at some extent, just a series of to-do lists of things that I cross off in order to sort of get to the bottom of a to-do list. But of course, you can never get to the bottom of that to-do list, not even briefly, which is, I think, has been depressing for me for most of my experience, most of my career. But, this book is an excellent way to reorient yourself with sort of a contrarian argument, if that's the right word for it, to sort of understand that maybe this is better news. Like, it's almost sort of a Buddhist principle, right? That it almost feels like that, yes, the struggle is the way. That the whole point of pushing this rock or standing in this spot or being completely silent or still or exposing yourself to these harsh conditions was itself precisely the point to drive at how you're supposed to embrace these things and not try to resist some of these things. He writes in the chapter on the efficiency trap, he says, let's begin with busyness. It isn't our only time problem, and it isn't everyone's problem, but it's a uniquely vivid illustration of the effort we invest in fighting against our built-in limitations thanks to how normal it has become to feel as though you absolutely must do more than you can do. Busyness is a misnomer for this state of affairs, really, because certain forms of busyness can be delightful. Who wouldn't want to live in Busy Town, the setting of the iconic 1960s children's book by the American illustrator Richard Scarry? His grocer cats and firefighting pigs are certainly busy. Nobody in Busy Town is idle, or if they are, they're carefully hidden from view by the authorities. What they aren't, though, is overwhelmed. They exude the cheery self-possession of cats and pigs who have plenty to do, but also every confidence that their tasks will fit snugly into the hours available, whereas we live with the constant anxiety of fearing or knowing for certain that ours won't. That is an important point, and that is something that I think I've been trying to wrap my brain around more as time has gone on over the last couple of years, recognizing that sort of the everlasting chase for more work doesn't do anything except beget more work. And the only solution to this, particularly if you yourself find yourself in a position where you're in a job where you feel like your work is inundating, that you're drowning in stuff to do, that you're being pushed to a limit that exceeds your ability to produce at a level that is commensurate with what you think is respectable, that the only solution to that is less work. And that there are only two avenues for most people, most of the time, to achieve that, which is that either you quit and you do something else, or that if you have the ability to talk with your supervisors or managers or whoever and get them to remove things from your list of to-dos, short of that, there is no other alternative. And if you can't figure that out on your own to sort of decide that, hey, I can figure out a way to get this to get off of my plate, there's something else. Like, what does that leave? There is nothing more for you in that circumstance. It's sort of like a Sisyphus inbox at that point, where it's just sort of where he actually writes, that's a phrase that he uses in here, where he says, this is a modern reaction to a modern problem, but it is not brand new. In 1908, the English journalist Arnold Bennett published a short and grouchy book of advice the title of which demonstrated that the anxious effort to fit more in what was already afflicting his Edwardian world. How to live on 24 hours a day. Recently, in a daily organ, a battle raged round the question of whether a woman can exist nicely in the country on 85 pounds a year, Bennett wrote. I have also seen an essay, How to Live on 8 shillings a week, but I have never seen an essay, How to Live on 24 hours a day. The joke, to spell it out, is how absurd it is that anyone should need such advice, since nobody has ever had more than 24 hours a day in which to live. Yet people did need it, and people continue to need it. There is a segment in this same chapter about the efficiency trap called The Bottomless Bucket List. And he says, all this talk of inboxes and washing machines risks giving the impression that feeling overwhelmed is solely a matter of having too much to do at the office or around the house. But there's a deeper sense in which merely to be alive on this planet today is to be haunted by the feeling of having too much to do, whether or not you lead a busy life in any conventional sense. Think of it as an existential overwhelm. The modern world provides an inexhaustible supply of things that seem worth doing. And so there arises an inevitable and unbridgeable gap between what you'd ideally like to do and what you actually can do. As the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa explains, pre-modern people weren't much troubled by such thoughts, partly because they believed in an afterlife. There was no particular pressure to, quote, get the most out of their limited time, because as far as they were concerned, it wasn't limited. And in any case, earthly life was but a relatively insignificant prelude to the most important part. They also tended to see the world as unchanging through history, or in some cultures, as cycling repeatedly through time, the same predictable stages. It felt like a known quantity. You were content to play your role in the human drama, a role that countless thousands had played before you, and thousands more would play after your death, without any sense that you were missing out on the exciting new possibilities of your particular moment in history. I would argue that in an unchanging or cyclical view of history, there never are any exciting new possibilities. But that's a different matter. I bring this up because it brings to light sort of a secular modernity to things, that if you are as people increasingly are much more secular and not a religious, faithful person, part of this can be a little hard, right? That understanding that we are going to die, that there is only so much that we can do on any given day and in any given lifespan, and that your lifespan isn't even guaranteed for the 4,000 weeks, that you could, be dead tomorrow. That without some level of spiritual awareness or hope that there is something for you to do after this, that can be hard. That is a hard thing to impress upon yourself, to grapple with. It is the question of ages. It's probably not something that you and I are going to cover on the topic of a half-hour podcast or so, but it's also something that if you struggle with this like I do, to the extent that I think that there is a gaping hole in most people's lives and in their culture for some kind of fellowship, and that some people can find this through other things like hobbies, like snowboarding with small groups, or book clubs, chess clubs, gyms, that sort of thing. That people need that sort of thing in their life. David Brooks has written about this in several of his books, and that most people aren't filling it, and that a lot of our social problems can be traced to this sort of thing. I think this book doesn't really touch on that so much as what I have been thinking about, but sort of making these connections between, sort of a casual catastrophe of our secular selves and our faithful selves. It has driven us to a point where we feel ever more disconnected, more entwined with the sort of economic requirements and engine of capitalism in our society, and our desire to make money because we feel like we need it in order to pay off a mortgage or student loans, or have the car that we use to get back and forth to work and that sort of thing. And as a result, we end up with a situation where we're all just infinitely unhappy, and we're all going to die. And what are we doing with this 4,000 weeks that we have, except living in this flywheel that just keeps spinning faster and faster, without giving us a whole lot of value? In fact, I would argue that humanity, by and large, over the last 50 years, certainly, has done a pretty good job of spinning off all the things that ever gave us any value and gave us any joy. And we just sort of ignored it, or cast it off, or told ourselves that it wasn't important anymore. Anyway, in a section back here about facing finitude, in a portion called Getting Real, he says, in his 2019 book, This Life, the Swedish philosopher Martin Höglund makes this all a bit clearer and less mystical by juxtaposing the idea or facing of our finitude with the religious belief in an eternal life. If you really thought life would never end, he argues, then nothing could ever genuinely matter, because you'd never be faced with having to decide whether or not to use a portion of your precious life on something. If I believed that my life would last forever, Höglund writes, I could never take my life to be at stake, and I would never be seized by the need to do anything with my time. Eternity would be deathly dull, because whatever you found yourself wondering whether or not to do any given thing on any given day, the answer would always be, who cares? After all, there's always tomorrow, and the next day, and the one after that. Höglund quotes a headline from the magazine U.S. Catholic that has the air of being written by a devout religious believer on whom an awful possibility has suddenly dawned. Heaven, will it be boring? By way of contrast, Höglund describes the annual summer vacation he spends with his extended family in a house on Sweden's wind-battered Baltic coast. It's intrinsic to the value of this experience, he notes, that he won't be around to experience it forever, that his relatives won't either, that his relationships with his relatives are therefore temporary, too, and that even the coastline in its current form is a transient phenomenon as dry land continues to emerge from the 12,000-year retreat of the region's glaciers. If Höglund were guaranteed an infinity of these summer vacations, there'd be nothing much to value about any of them. It's only the guarantee that he definitely won't have an infinity of them that makes them worth valuing. And therein lies a nugget of something right there, which is that scarcity has value. And that scarcity is what allows the scant 4,000 weeks that we have in the context of this book, or ever how much time it is that we end up having, that gives it value. And that we do just have this scant little amount of time to do whatever it is that we do. This, however, can also come across as being a little terrifying because it can put you in a position where you start thinking about, oh my God, I have to do something because I could be dead at any moment. This is something that I struggle with from time to time, particularly because just my family history of people having a bad habit of dying very early. And I find that I think about that a lot, and it weighs heavily on me, and it's probably cutting my lifespan because I think about it so much. Anyway, there's a section back here called Becoming a Better Procrastinator in chapter 4. And one of the things that I'm noticing about this book, too, is that all the best parts of the book are actually written in the first page or two of each chapter. So if you really wanted to skim this book, there is a summary section at the end that's helpful. But you could also probably get a lot out of this book by just picking it up, reading the first couple of pages of each chapter, and then putting it back down. Anyway, he writes, perhaps we're in danger of getting a little too metaphysical about all this, though. Many of the philosophers who've pondered the subject of human finitude have been reluctant to translate their observations into practical advice because that smacks of self-help, and heaven forbid anyone might want to help themselves. Yet their insights do have concrete ramifications for daily life. Apart from anything else, they make it clear that the core challenge of managing our limited time isn't about how to get everything done, that's never going to happen, but how to decide most wisely what not to do, and how to feel at peace about not doing it. As the American author and teacher Greg Crinch puts it, we need to learn to get better at procrastinating. Procrastination of some kind is inevitable. Indeed, at any given moment, you'll be procrastinating on almost everything, and by the end of your life, you'll have gotten around to doing virtually none of the things you theoretically could have done. So the point isn't to eradicate procrastination, but to choose more wisely what you're going to procrastinate on in order to focus on what matters most. The real measure of any time management technique is whether or not it helps you neglect the right things. This is, in so many ways, a restatement of something that has become sort of a mantra for a lot of people, particularly that are of the Silicon Valley types and business leaders who espouse the notion that, that for every yes, there's 1,000 no's, that old Steve Jobs notion, that all the things that they're proud of at Apple are the things they said no to over the years. And so this is a different way of saying it, but I think it says it in a much fuller way, a way that gives some credence that goes beyond business and sort of deciding, well, it's best that I decide against doing work with this client or working on this project because I'm supposed to say no to more things, but recognizing, you know what, maybe I don't need to be a jujitsu master. Maybe I can just sort of, do well with what I was already doing to improve my overall fitness, for example. There is in the same chapter about becoming a better procrastinator, he says, the second principle is to limit your work in progress. Perhaps the most appealing way to resist the truth about your finite time is to initiate a large number of projects at once. That way you get to feel as though you're keeping plenty of irons in the fire and making progress on all fronts. Instead, what usually ends up happening is that you make progress on no fronts because each time a project starts to feel difficult or frightening or boring, you can bounce off to a different one instead. You get to preserve your sense of being in control of things, but at the cost of never finishing anything important. The alternative approach is to fix a hard upper limit on the number of things that you allow yourself to work on at any given time. He goes on to describe how this works in sort of a business sense, but I would argue that, again, this is sort of a restatement of the sort of things that we've heard from a lot of people in the business world a long time, is to sort of limit your work in progress and that real artists ship, right? This is another way of saying it from a Steve Jobs line, real artists ship. The problem, however, is that if you're not really in control of a lot of your work, if someone else controls that workflow for you, it can be hard to manage those sorts of expectations. This is where having really good managers comes into play. The third principle, he writes, is to resist the allure of middling priorities. There is a story attributed to Warren Buffett, although probably only in the apocryphal way in which wise insights get attributed to Albert Einstein or the Buddha, regardless of their real source, in which the famously shrewd investor is asked by his personal pilot about how to set priorities. I'd be tempted to respond, quote, just focus on flying the plane. But apparently this didn't take place mid-flight because Buffett's advice is different. He tells the man to make a list of the top 25 things he wants out of life and then to arrange them in order from the most important to the least. The top 5, Buffett says, should be those around which he organizes his time. But contrary to what the pilot might have been expecting to hear, the remaining 20, Buffett allegedly explains, aren't the second-tier priorities to which he should turn when he gets the chance. Far from it. In fact, they're the ones he should actively avoid at all costs, because they're the ambitions that are insufficiently important to him to form the core of his life, yet are seductive enough to distract him from the ones that matter most. I hadn't heard that particular story, or if I had, I don't know that I remember hearing that particular story. I would say that when I heard that, part of me thought, I don't know that I could write down 25 things that I want to do in my life or 25 things that I care about in my life. Part of me wants to try it at some point to see if I could even get to 15, maybe even 10. So try that yourself. See if you can sit down, pull out a piece of paper, and see if you can write out at most 25 things that you want to do with your life, and then sort them in importance, and then lop off the bottom 20 and just stick with the top 5 and see how that makes you feel. There's a segment in this same chapter about becoming a better procrastinator about the inevitability of settling. And this one was one I thought everybody should hear. He says, which brings me to one of the few pieces of dating advice I feel entirely confident in delivering, though in fact it's relevant in every other sphere of life too. It concerns settling, the ubiquitous modern fear that you might find yourself committing to a romantic partner who falls short of your ideal or who's unworthy of your excellent personality. The career-related version of this worry entails settling for a job that pays the bills rather than going all in on your passion. The received wisdom, articulated in 1,000 magazine articles and inspirational Instagram memes, is that it's always a crime to settle, but the received wisdom is wrong. You should definitely settle. As an aside, I was thinking about that old Edna Krabappel scene in The Simpsons where Lisa asks whether or not she should settle with I think it was Ralph, and Edna Krabappel says, "Oh, honey, you should settle and don't ever let go." Anyway, the author goes on to write, or to be more precise, you don't have a choice. You will settle. And this fact ought to please you. The American political theorist Robert Goodin wrote a whole treatise on this topic, on settling, in which he demonstrates, to start with, that we're inconsistent when it comes to what we define as settling. Everyone seems to agree that if you embark on a relationship when you secretly suspect you could find someone better, you're guilty of settling, because you're opting to use up a portion of your life with a less than ideal partner. But since time is finite, the decision to refuse to settle, to spend a decade restlessly scouring online dating networks for the perfect person, is also a case of settling, because you're opting to use up a decade of your time, your limited time, in a different sort of less than ideal situation. Moreover, Gooden observes, we tend to contrast a life of settling with a life of what he labels striving, or living life to the fullest. But this is a mistake too, and not just because settling is unavoidable, but also because living life to the fullest requires settling. You must settle, in a relatively enduring way, upon something that you will be the object of your striving, in order for that striving to count as striving. He writes, you can't become an ultra-successful lawyer or artist or politician without first settling on law or art or politics and therefore deciding to forego the potential rewards of other careers. If you flip between them all, you'll succeed in none of them. Likewise, there's no possibility of a romantic relationship being truly fulfilling unless you're willing, at least for a while, to settle for that specific relationship with all its imperfections, which means spurning the seductive lure of an infinite number of superior imaginary alternatives. Of course, we all rarely approach relationships with such wisdom and intent. He goes on to say that we usually spend years failing to commit to any one relationship, either by finding a reason to call things off as soon as they become serious, or at any point they become sort of half-hearted in approach. I think that I had never encountered a little nugget of wisdom like that was so deep. I did not expect to find that in this book. It sort of gives you a sense of the breadth of some of the things that this book talks about, to the extent that it touches on so many powerful components of life. If you're somebody that worries a lot or thinks a lot about either your mortality or what you're doing with your life, you might enjoy this book. Overall, I'd give it about 3 stars, because I think that, like I said earlier, I think that the book has a stronger beginning than it does an ending. And I think that the ending is a little morbid to the extent that it's like, yeah, we're all going to die. And when we do, this will all be for naught. Anyway, he writes in a chapter called The Watermelon Problem, a machine for misusing your life. All of which helps clarify what's so... Well, I'm going to back up a little bit. Let me get back up. There's a segment of the last paragraph of the piece before this that talks about, are we really having it all? And he says, can you have an experience you don't experience? The finest meal at a Michelin-starred restaurant might as well be a plate of instant noodles if your mind is elsewhere. And a friendship to which you never actually give a moment's thought is a friendship in name only. Attention is the beginning of devotion, writes the poet Mary Oliver, pointing to the fact that distraction and care are incompatible with each other. You can't truly love a partner or a child, dedicate yourself to a career or to a cause, or just savor the pleasure of a stroll in the park, except to the extent that you can hold your attention on the subject of your devotion to begin with. This gets in touch with the last show, In Praise of Slowness by Carl Honore, about slowing down and sort of being more observant and methodical and living with a little bit more depth about all the things that we do day to day, even the simple stuff like walking the dog. He writes, all of which helps clarify what's so alarming about the contemporary online attention economy, of which we've heard so much in recent years. It's essentially a giant machine for persuading you to make the wrong choices about what to do with your attention, and therefore with your finite life, by getting you to care about things you didn't want to care about. And you have far too little control over your attention simply to decide, as if by fiat, that you're not going to succumb to its temptations. I'd argue again that, similar to what we talked about in the In Praise of Slowness book, that we really don't have much control over our emotions sometimes, that we don't really have much control over our attention. One thing that we have control over is generally our environment. And so if you can change your environment to avoid some of these terrible things like social media, that your life is likely to improve. Towards the end of the book, there's a section here on chapter 9 called Rediscovering Rest. He writes, one boiling summer weekend a few years ago, I joined the impassioned members of a campaigning group called Take Back Your Time in an airless university lecture theater in Seattle, where they'd assembled to further their long-standing mission of eliminating the epidemic of overwork. The gathering in which I participated, their annual conference, was a sparsely attended affair, in part because, as the organizers conceded, it was August and lots of people were on vacation, and America's most stridently pro-relaxation organization could hardly complain about that. But it was also because Take Back Your Time promotes what counts, these days, as a highly subversive message. There's nothing unusual about its demands for more days off or shorter working hours. Such proposals are increasingly common, but they're always almost justified on the grounds that a well-rested worker is a more productive worker. And it was precisely this rationale that the group had been set up to question. Why, its members wanted to know, should vacations by the oceans, or meals with friends, or lazy mornings in bed need defending in terms of improvement performance at work? You keep hearing people arguing that more time off might be good for the economy, fumed John DeGraff, an ebullient 70-ish filmmaker and the driving force behind Take Back Your Time. But why should we have to justify life in terms of the economy? It makes no sense. Later, I learned about the existence of a rival initiative, Project Time Off, which, unlike Take Back Your Time, enjoyed generous corporate sponsorship and better attended conferences, and it was no surprise to learn that its mission was to promote the personal, business, social, and economic benefits of leisure. It was also backed by the U.S. Travel Association, which has its own reasons for wanting people to take more vacations. He goes on here in a section to talk about the decline of pleasure. I don't know that there's necessarily a decline of pleasure. He talks a little bit about how people don't take vacation time and all that usual stuff. I don't know that I don't know if there's a decline in pleasure. I think there's a shift in pleasure. I think people have exchanged the pleasure that we sort of allot ourselves in different ways. And some of those is things like looking at social media. We look at Instagram now as a form of pleasure to pass over boredom. In reality, that's not that pleasurable. It's very shallow. It doesn't provide lots of long-standing value to us. In fact, it usually does more long-term harm than good. And in that context, is that better or worse than sort of bundling up your time to sort of save it for the end of the day when you just sit on the porch and stare out at the stars? I don't know. I would argue that from my personal standpoint on that is that that's just a shift in people's choice of pleasure, and that it's not ideal. I think you could probably even argue that with the rise of various dating apps, there's probably been a shift in culture around hookups and sex, and that there are probably more people who are more prone or more keen to sort of swap pursuits of celibacy and marriage and what I think we could all recognize, at least academically, as powerful emotional feelings towards a partner in exchange, at least for a while, in short-term hookups and online pornography, and that the trade-off from those things probably isn't worth it and probably does more long-term harm than good. But tomato, tomato, and everyone's unto themselves. There's a section towards the end here called Staying on the Bus, or at least in a chapter called Staying on the Bus. And he writes about an art teacher at Harvard University named Jennifer Roberts. And he says, when you take a class with Roberts, your initial assignment is always the same, and it's one that has been known to elicit yelps of horror from her students. Choose a painting or sculpture in a local museum, then go and look at it for 3 hours straight. No checking email or social media, no quick runs to Starbucks, although she reluctantly concedes that bathroom breaks are allowed. And when I told a friend that I planned to visit Harvard to meet Roberts and to undertake the painting viewing exercise myself, he gave me a look that mixed admiration with fear for my sanity, as though I'd announced my intention to kayak the Amazon alone. And he wasn't entirely wrong to worry about my mental health. There were long moments as I squirmed in my seat at the Harvard Art Museum during the assignment, when I'd willingly have done countless things I usually can't stand. Shopping for clothes, assembling flat-pack furniture, stabbing myself in the thigh with thumbtacks, simply because I could have done them in a rush instead of having to be patient. And he goes on to say that these reactions are no surprise to Roberts, and that's part of the value of the assignment. It was something that I thought was something that was so applicable and useful to anybody that you could probably go to your local museum or local park or garden and take a look at some sculpture or piece and just stare at it for 3 hours with no phone, maybe grab a bottle of water at the most, and just sit there and look at it and see where your mind goes. He writes a little bit about how time shifted for him and how things changed in sort of his thinking about it, and how the first 90 minutes was really hard, but then the last 90 minutes was sort of, again, that Buddhist awakening of understanding, I'm starting to understand and recognize some of the parts of this that I wouldn't have if I had just sort of glanced by it quickly. He also talks in this same chapter about originality and unoriginality and sort of an incrementalist approach to things. One critical aspect of the radical incrementalist approach, which runs counter to much mainstream advice on productivity, is thus to be willing to stop when your daily time is up, even when you're bursting with energy and feeling as though you could get much more done. If you've decided to work on a given project for 50 minutes, then once 50 minutes have elapsed, get up and walk away from it. Why? Because, as explained, the urge to push forward beyond that point includes a big component of impatience, about not being finished, about not being productive enough, about never finding such an ideal time for work. Stopping helps strengthen the muscle of patience that will permit you to return to the project again and again, and thus to sustain your productivity over an entire career. The final principle is that, more often than not, originality lies on the far side of unoriginality. The Finnish American photographer Arno Minikin demonstrates that through this deep truth about the power of patience with a parable about Helsinki's main bus station. He says there are 24 platforms there, he explains, with several different bus lines departing each one. And for the first part of its journey, each bus leaving from any given platform takes the same route through the city as all the others, making identical stops. Think of each stop as representing 1 year of your career. Mencken advises photography students. You say, you pick an artistic direction. Perhaps you start working on platinum studies or nudes, and you begin to accumulate a portfolio of work. 3 years, or bus stops later, you proudly present it to the owner of a gallery, but you're dismayed to be told that your pictures aren't as original as you thought because they look like knockoffs of the work of the photographer Irving Penn. Penn's bus, it turns out, had been on the same route as yours. Annoyed at yourself for having wasted 3 years following somebody else's path, you jump off that bus, hail a taxi, and return to where you started at the bus station. This time you board a different bus, choosing a different genre of photography in which to specialize. But a few stops later, the same thing happens. You're informed that your new body of work seems derivative too. Back you go to the bus station, but the pattern keeps on repeating. Nothing you produce ever gets recognized as truly being your own. And so what's the solution? It's simple, he says. Stay on the bus. It's because when you get further out on the bus, that's when the branches start to happen and things go their own way. I thought that was an interesting parable. I hadn't heard that before. I think it's useful for artists and creative types. It spoke to me probably because I do a lot of creative work for my day job. And it struck me as something that makes a lot of sense and something that I think that gets at imposter syndrome for a lot of people, and recognizing that we're just kind of all on the same route here for a little while until we stay on it long enough that we start making our own turns. The last thing I want to talk about here is about time. And he has a thing in here about the USSR that I did not know about. He says that the other way to grasp how greatly we benefit from surrendering to communal time, that is, and this is me talking, that is like having a shared break time at work, for example, where everybody takes the same lunch break or everyone gathers for an office party, for example. He says, whether we realize it or not, is to watch what happens when people are forcibly prevented from doing something in communal time. The historian Clive Foss has described the nightmare that transpired when the leadership of the Soviet Union, gripped by the desire to transform the nation into one blazingly efficient machine, set out to re-engineer time itself. The Soviets had long been inspired by the work of the efficiency expert Frederick Winslow Taylor, whose philosophy of scientific management had aimed to squeeze the maximum possible output from American factory workers. But now Joseph Stalin's chief economist, Yuri Larin, concocted what seems in hindsight like a ludicrously ambitious plan to keep Soviet factories running every day of the year with no breaks. Henceforth, he announced, in August 1929, a week would be not 7, but 5 days long. 4 days of work, followed by 1 day's rest. Crucially, though, the idea was that not all workers would follow the same calendar. Instead, they'd be divided into 5 groups, identified by a color: yellow, green, orange, purple, and red, each of which would then be assigned a different 4-day work week and 1-day weekend, so that operations would never have to cease even for a day. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities argued there would be too numerous benefits for the proletariat too. More frequent days off, plus less overcrowding of cultural institutions and supermarkets thanks to the steadier flow of customers. But the main effect for ordinary citizens of the USSR, as the writer Judith Shulevitz has explained, was to destroy the possibility of social life. It was a simple question of scheduling. 2 friends assigned to 2 different calendar groups would never be free to socialize on the same day. Husbands and wives were supposed to be assigned to the same group, but they often weren't, placing intense stress on families, and for obvious reasons, Sunday religious gatherings were disrupted too, neither of which posed a problem from Moscow's point of view, given their hostility towards both family and church. As one worker rather daringly complained to the official newspaper, "What are we to do at home if the wife is in the factory, the children in school, and no one can come to see us? What is left but go to the public tea room? What kind of life is that when holidays come in shifts and not for all workers together? That's no holiday if you have to celebrate it by yourself." I highlighted that because I feel like we in America, and particularly, I think that we've sort of self-sorted into this. I think that culturally we have built our way into this space where we don't allow time for other people. We don't even allow time for our spouses and our families sometimes, that we fill it with work and activities and school and all sorts of other stuff. And whatever value those things give us, I think that we are oblivious to the loss that comes when we don't have time to spend with other people in a relaxed and social way. I think the loss of civic organizations and book clubs and having wine with friends, playing bridge together or playing sports together, I think these have turned America into what the USSR had tried to turn itself into for the sake of efficiency and at the loss of everything else. Anyway, the book is 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. I gave it 3 stars. I think it's got a pretty solid beginning. I think that there's some depth to it. I think it's a little chilling, a little morbid at times, but very real. And you can tell that the author has given this a lot of thought, and that they have given it, they have given this sort of philosophy of how to approach life a sense of meaning that other people can find approachable in this book. And I think you'll like it if you worry about your mortality, worry about slowing down, or are looking for ways to sort of recognize what you might be doing to yourself without realizing what you're doing to yourself.